Okay, finally. Thank you so much, all the people that are making your time to join us for another exciting public lecture hosting by the School of Architecture and Built Environment, UCSI University. It's really our pleasure to hosting everyone on this interesting webinar this afternoon. And really apologize for a slight delay due to struggling on putting up the live, right? But no pressure. I think later on we can upload the recording into the page. Yeah, right. Now let me start with a quick introduction of myself. Right. So my name is Keng-Khoon, and I will be the moderator for today's session. Public intention to for knowledge sharing, right? So whether you are a student, you are a practitioner, researcher, or you are just a public member, we are hope to engage everyone into a public dialogue across a wide ranging of topic that we are putting for a public lecture, right? So that is what today we are going to do. Now, before I am starting, I just have to make some disclaimer, which I hope that everyone pay attention to some of this, the disclaimer I'm going to say. So number one, the school does not represent any commentary made in this lecture. Number two, this lecture is simply organized for a scholarly discussion, any advisory purposes on the topic that we are going to discuss later. And the views, information, or opinion expressed during the lecture are solely those of the individual involved and do not necessarily represent their institution. And lastly, the organizer during the lecture. Now, you may take this, just as this public lecture, right? So definitely, we really welcome all the comments and questions from the participant. You can actually make your question on the chat box, right? Then our invited speaker or some members of the faculty member may respond to your question after the presentation, right? Now, but however, due to the time constraint and limitation, we might not be able to pick up everyone question, right? So in the question, we also hopefully that everyone you could address yourself, right? Then we know identify yourself and with the question, right? Now and a quick reminder on housekeeping. Please mute yourself along the presentation, right? So to reduce any interruption to the audience, right? Now, so after this disclaimer, I am really glad to present to you the topics of our today's public lecture. Now, is protest and public space, ritual of democracy in the city, right? Now, it's really exciting topic, and I myself personally found it is also very timely because when we are looking back into a couple of years, not only in a Malaysia context, when you see in a worldwide, there has been a lot of uncertainty and social unrest that actually happening across, places, all the way from Black Lives Matter, Asian hate, the kind of racism, and also, recently, of course, the pandemic, the COVID-19, people across, places are rather been is really a very topic that we bring into the discussion. So now, without further ado, to introduce our Dr. So let me a very short introduction of the speaker today. Dr. Sorry, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, right. Sorry for the interruption. Okay, now let me give a short introduction to our speaker. So Dr. Azreen is currently a senior lecturer at the Technology and Informatics Razak, UTM-KL, right? So he academic focus has been looking at the politics of space and the participatory movement in the public life, right? And he's very interested to understand how the kind of public space are being governed, and also how it's actually in relation to, you know, a wide-ranging impact of privatization, gentrification, you know, and of course, you know, the protests and them well, they're happening in an urban public space. Yeah. So before that, he actually graduated a Part 2 architect by training from UTM, and after that, he followed his further Master of Urban Design at Bartlett UCL, and he completed her PhD at TU Delft, Netherlands, a few years back, with a topic on exactly the topic for today, which is the spaces of protest. Right. Now, before I invite Azreen to begin the talk, I just would like, you know, to set up the tone for today's talk by showing, you know, a concept which I myself really like it. Yeah, the right to the city, and is a profound, best known concept from Henry Lefebvre, right? And many of you should have known him and heard about this concept. Now, Lefebvre is a French, you know, sociologist, philosopher, and activist, right? And back into a 1960s, 70s, he came out, you know, with this concept of the right to the city based on the Marxism concept, right? And I think it's really pop up, you know, to our talk today. We are really questioning about, you know, with this ideas of the right to the city. Now, the right to the city is as an expression of people, you know, a normal people, everyone, trying to shape their own destiny, active citizenship, and a more equitable city life. Yeah, so I think this is really a matter everyone, you know, especially we are living in an urban age, right? We need a more affordable housing. We are hopeful, you know, hopefully to you know, without any limitation, you know, across gender, across income, you know, across all the aspects in our city life, right? So this best known concept is really call for more participatory and also democratic city life, could actually cherish into our you know, our urban space, which is the public space. So with this concept, I think it's a good start that, you know, we hold this as a premise along the whole talk. Then without further ado, I for the talk. Yeah, so over to you, Azreen.
Okay, thank you, KK. I think I'll just share my screen straight away. Can you enable screen sharing?
Yes, right, go ahead.
Okay. Just make this full screen.
Yeah, we see your screen. Can you make it full screen?
Can you see the whole slide now? Or are you seeing the presenters' notes?
Yeah, it's perfect.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, all right. Hi, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank KK, Dr. Keng-Khoon, for inviting me to give this lecture, and UCSI in general for hosting me today. The title of my lecture today is Protest and Public Space, Rituals of Democracy in the City, where I will be discussing the political role of the built environment. So when we talk about cities, we often talk about notions of livability, sustainability, community, low carbon, etc., all these buzzwords, right? And the measures of whether cities work or not are often seen through the lens of how well we can live, work, and play in the city. So this is why we often discuss issues like affordable housing, public transport, provision of parks, greeneries, and public spaces in general, because these things affect our lives directly day in, day out. So today we will discuss the urban in a slightly different way. We will look at the political dimension of our cities, how our infrastructures, in particular public space, shape the performance of democracy. Okay, so the focus of this lecture today stems from my doctoral work titled Seditious Spaces, Protests in Post-Colonial Malaysia, which I completed at UDelf a few years ago. So for my doctoral work, I examined the relationship between public space and democracy with a particular focus on the use of public space for protest. So the Bersih protest in 2015 served as the site for my empirical work, where I observed both the material and discursive spaces of protest. This means that, while observing the protest firsthand, by going to the ground and being there in person, I was also observing what was being said on social media. And I put both of these together to reconstruct the space created by the protest. Now, how did I get into this, right? So it all began in 2011, so 10 years already, where there were a lot of protests taking place around the world, such as the Arab Spring in the Middle East, the Occupy movement in New York, and the Indignados in Spain. So all of these protests took place in urban spaces, which are all very different from one another. So Tahrir Square in Cairo, for example, is basically a huge roundabout in the city, while Zuccotti Park in New York is a privately owned space, or POPs, as they call it. And Puerta del Sol in Madrid, the square occupied at the beginning of the Indignados, is your typical European square, right? So as an urban designer, I was really interested in where protests were taking place and how urban form can actually influence the shape of the protest. So for example, in Buenos Aires, protesters tend to air their grievances directly to the corresponding authorities, right? Meaning if they weren't happy with how the city is being governed, then they'd go and protest in front of the city hall. If they weren't happy with matters of national importance, then they'd march to the presidential palace, right? In other places, it's actually not so clear cut. So in Seoul, for example, in Korea, certain spots are used repeatedly for protests, regardless of the source of grievance. So protesters would also use the wider boulevards for marching. But once the authorities started chasing them, they would just disappear into the maze of small alleyways, which are connected to these bigger boulevards. So closer to home, of course, in the same year, 2011, we had the Bersih protest. I probably do not need to introduce Bersih to you, since they have been playing a prominent role in our local political landscape. But for those who probably didn't know, Bersih is a coalition of civil societies who fought for electoral reform. They first took to the streets in 2007, then again in 2011, so Bersih 2, 2011. 2013, 2015, and 2016. And all of their protests took place mainly in the streets of Kuala Lumpur, even if they were held simultaneously in other Malaysian cities like Kota Kinabalu and even abroad in places like London. So as I was observing the global events and thinking about Bersih, I got really curious as to why protests are actually very rarely organized in Putrajaya, right? I mean, this city was actually purposely built for administration. Why do people still go to KL to protest, even after most federal functions have actually moved to Putrajaya? But we'll come back to this later. So I want to talk more. About the more general trend that Bersih belonged to. So what was the similarity between all of these protests that made the news in 2011? So much so that Time magazine even named their person of the year for 2011 as the protester. Right. So the main parallel between these protests was that they used social media. Organizing and mobilizing for protest using social media is something that we take for granted today. I mean, it's normal, right? I mean, you just like go to Facebook and you would see like people are saying that, okay, let's go to the streets in 2 weeks' time, or on Twitter or whatever, but 10 years ago, this was really, considered groundbreaking. So this is because Facebook and Twitter were only introduced around 2006 and 2007, right? So naturally, as the Merlina Lim, a scholar who studied these things, as she observed, Facebook and Twitter were included in protest repertoire as any technology available to the masses would, and it basically came of age around 2011. So the rise of Bersih can also be attributed to the use of social media. And by their second outing into 2011, Bersih were already quite conversant with the utilization of new media to mobilize people to go to the streets. Social media also enabled rallies held in solidarity with Bersih to take place in 32 cities all over the world. So even though my initial interest into the subject was driven mostly by concerns over the material public space, given the prominence of social media in all these protests that took place on the streets, it would seem foolish actually to ignore the role of the digital space in all of this. So social movements and dissidents have always incorporated new technology which were available in daily life into their operations. So for example, in 1998, because access to the internet was not as widespread as it is today, activists actually printed out information circulating in online fora and mailing lists and distribute these pieces of paper as flyers and posters in the streets. And likewise, so that was in Reformasi in Indonesia, yeah. Likewise, in 2001, text messages were used to mobilize people against the Estrada regime in the Philippines. And more recently, we saw how people flock to Clubhouse, right? It is still a new app. And I actually saw somebody commenting that in other countries in Southeast Asia, like Thailand and Myanmar, when people were upset, they went to the streets, but in Malaysia, they just go to Clubhouse to vent. So it's quite easy to see why social media were attractive, especially in contexts where the regime tend to be more oppressive and would have exerted control over the more traditional mainstream media. Since social media allows interaction between a lot of people to happen in real time, regardless of location, as long as you have internet connection, of course. So it was quickly included into the infrastructure of protest. So for mobilizing support, coordinating actions, building transnational networks, and broadcasting events and information. So for this particular aspect, the works of David Meek and Merlina Lim are particularly instructive. right? So already in 2012, David Meek observed that the dichotomy between the material and the cyberspaces was actually dissolving with the emergence of Web 2.0 and Media 2.0 in 2004. Marlena Lim she actually conducted research on a Bersih protest, and that was actually how I came across her work. And I've actually found it fascinating because she examined both material and digital spaces simultaneously. So Marlena Lim argued that the dichotomy between cyber activism and place-based analysis is created by treating them differently and separately. But the digital media is actually rooted in the physical world. So these social networks that we're talking about, talking about Twitter or Facebook, whatever, they are not placeless. They are actually rooted in very, very physical geographical locations. And Marlena Lim also talked about the intermodality between social networks and other media, which then creates a hybrid space for social movements. I like Lim's model of the hybrid space because she included very physical media as well, things that we don't even like think about as media, such as, she used this example of sneakers containing memory cards, thrown across the border during the Tunisian revolt. And also coffee shops where face-to-face interactions promote sympathy and exchange of information. So thinking about these two spaces separately, particularly when you're just focusing on social networks and communication in the digital space, this can be limiting because the digital is embedded within the material world from the physical infrastructure needed to make this digital space possible in the first place, all these pylons and stuff, right? To how we actually constantly move from the digital to material spaces throughout the day, and these two things, they just fit into one another. Anyways, back to my case study. So for the empirical part of my research, as I've mentioned earlier, I focused my data collection on the Bersih protest in 2015, which took place simultaneously in Kuala Lumpur, in Peninsular Malaysia, and Kuching and Kota Kinabalu in East Malaysia. So it was the only Bersih protest that took place over 2 days and actually managed to occupy public space without much interference from the authorities. The first three were really quite violent. Bersih was significant because it triggered a reaction in the form of the red shirt protest. While Bersih took place on the eve of the celebration of Independence Day, 31st August, the red shirts also chose a significant date to organize the Malay Dignity Rally, 16 September, the date Malaysia was first formed as a country back in 1963. And when the red shirts first made its appearance, they protested against Bersih, whom they argued was damaging the country. Later on, the protest was reframed as a Malay reaction against the Chinese-dominated Bersih. So for this protest, I collected the data by scraping Twitter posts, hashtagged Bersih4, and I also went to the streets to observe the protest firsthand as it unfolded in the streets. So I managed to actually collect more than 300,000 tweets about the protest. I think it's important that we discuss the affordance of Twitter for a little bit because the Twitter that we have now is a bit different than the Twitter that existed when I was collecting my data, right? So when I collected my data, Twitter still only allowed 140 characters instead of the 280 that we have today. And we couldn't post images directly into our tweets. Images would be represented by a URL, which you then have to click on your own if you wanted to see them. So then this URL would eat into your 140 characters as well. So you really have to be economical, right, with your tweets. So I would argue that these particular affordances of Twitter shaped the interaction that took place during the protest, about the protest, And if we were afforded the Twitter of today, during that protest, the dynamics of the interaction would have been somewhat different. So back then we had to be economical because of these limitations, right? So because of that, I think people used hashtags a lot more than, because hashtags are already loaded with meaning. So images would also at times be accompanied only by hashtags, right? Because you don't have the space to type anything else, right? We couldn't create threads on Twitter as well. So each tweet kind of had to be enough to stand on its own. There's no context, right? So and this, of course, this really shaped how people used Twitter back then. Okay, but these images, right, that people were tweeting, with the hashtags, where did they come from? So especially when we're talking about social movements, right? So here I find the work of John Parkinson on Spaces of Democracy useful. So in the beginning, when digital communication started becoming possible, there emerged a debate that digital spaces would no sooner replace physical spaces, right? I mean, we don't need streets anymore. We don't need to go to the streets, to go to the squares anymore to protest or to meet people. We can just meet and discuss on the internet, which is basically what we're doing now. Yep. So Alvin Toffler, I'm sure some of you are familiar with Alvin Toffler. So Toffler was a futurist who wrote books on digital and communication revolution. So Toffler predicted that digital communication would eventually hollow out cities, as connectivity would allow people to not be in the same physical space anymore, but still be connected, right? Because we have the internet, right? So we are kind of seeing this today, but only because the pandemic has created the conditions for it to happen. We are forced to stay home, right? And because we have the internet, then we are still connected to others. Otherwise, I mean, before the pandemic, right? What happened was all this connectivity actually mediated migration and travel. So people actually there was a lot more mobility because of the internet. So this is basically what Saskia Sassen observed, that the advancement of digital telecommunications technology has actually intensified cities. And this led to the emergence of global cities which are financial centers like London and New York. And these cities were and still are so very much wired, right? And with the internet, it became easier, of course, to be exposed to other places and to arrange for travel. And then this led to the emergence of these things called platform urbanism, like Uber and Airbnb, and of course, the rise of travel influencers, right? So when faced with this argument that we do not need physical public spaces anymore because the internet has taken over this function, if we were to learn from these social media protests, is that a successful protest is one where it doesn't just stay online. Actions actually spill into the streets. And images produced from this, what's happening on the streets, would then be picked up by the media, both mainstream media and new media. So if you and I were tweeting about it, then we are participating in this new media, we're part of the new media. And these images would be broadcasted and amplified in the digital space, right? Because it's probably easier to ignore 10,000 tweets, that are angry at you, right? Than 10,000 people on the streets, coming together, taking the trouble to go to the streets because they are upset with you. And even during this pandemic, when most eyeballs were actually stuck on screens, certain notable protests like the Black Lives Matter in the US and also protests in Thailand and Myanmar also spilled out into the streets. And of course, more recently, we also saw this taking place in Kuala Lumpur, where the Lawan protesters marched from LRT station Masjid Jamek, Dau Jalan Tun Perak, Dataran Merdeka. So Dataran Merdeka, the biggest and physically the most accessible open space in Kuala Lumpur, is also the most desirable venue for protest. So constructed by the British, it became a symbol of emancipation from colonial rule. And we can see this through, this state-sponsored celebration of Independence Day, right? So the standing assumption is that the history of the Dataran lends it a symbolic character. So the Dataran was constructed by the British, and when they moved to KL from Klang, following the growing prosperity of the area due to tin mining in the 1850s. So it exemplifies a typical colonial spatial typology in British Malaya, the Padang, that the British would construct wherever they built towns. So the Padang typology could be traced to the Maidan in British India. So this also shows how, there's like this transfer of technology from one colony to another during this era. The Dataran is a rectangular space, a Cartesian imposition on the wild tropical jungle. I mean, we have to think about what this area looked like in the 1850s, right? It was just a jungle. So when you put something like this, this Cartesian imposition is basically a spatial and visual disciplining tool. And the British used it for military purposes and for less belligerent activities like playing cricket in the afternoon. So it's an open space, defined by the grand buildings built in the style of the British Raj, and the clubhouse was Mok Tudor. And the architecture was also a mark of colonial diplomacy, just like a nod to the Muslim sultans, right? And this is mixed with the Western neoclassical architecture. So the Union Jack was actually lowered down here for one last time on the eve of independence, 31st August 1957. But the actual proclamation was actually held at the Stadium Merdeka, built specifically for this purpose, And in 1989, the Padang was renamed as Dataran Merdeka. But if we are talking about symbols, right? I mean, we can also make the same argument for Putrajaya, which was actually designed to serve as a symbol of democracy, with its like white boulevard and postmodern architecture, and these overly designed bridges, spanning over this man-made water body, right? So I actually asked somebody from Bersih, right? I mean, you have all of this space in Putrajaya, so why don't you guys organize your protest there, right? That's also where the seat of power is. I received a very short answer. It's, transport, right? And similarly, for the recent Lawan protest, during one of the Twitter Spaces session, the organizer stated that the reason why Dataran was chosen as the venue was because it is the largest open space in the city. So it's good for physical distancing. And also the Dataran has a thick layer of radical history since it has seen so many protests. So I find this point very interesting. Since when we discuss the history of Dataran, we often talk about this colonial history, basically what I was talking about earlier, right? And very rarely, actually, we frame it in the history of dissent. So by saying that, the organizer is basically decentering the European colonial experience as a reference point, and instead using this other more local history of struggle and dissent against power as the focus. I have no idea whether it was a deliberate thing by them, but it was really, really refreshing, actually. Okay, so this history of dissent on the Dataran, right? So let's take a look at this map of more recent protests held in the city from 1998 to 2016. It is by no means a comprehensive map. There's more after 2016, of course, which have not been included here. What is this map telling us, really. It's basically showing us that protests in Kuala Lumpur tends to be concentrated within a 3-kilometer radius of the historic core. And more importantly, most of the protests actually aim to congregate on the Dataran, right? You can see like Dataran Merdeka has like the longest list of protests. So for Bersih 4, like any other protests before it that wished to use the Dataran, entrance to the square was blocked by the authorities, who gave the excuse that the square was being prepped for the celebration of Independence Day. The protesters chose to politely comply and actually ended up occupying the junction to the north of the square. Yeah, so Bersih 4 was mostly here. And they were also really adamant about abiding by the instructions, that they even set up a line of human chain in front of the barricade put in place by the authorities in order to make sure that none of their own protesters could actually make it onto the square. So this might seem counterintuitive, right? I mean, why? Surely it made more sense for them to just like, go against the authority and then, fight their way into the square. But actually, occupying that junction was a masterstroke. Bersih ended up occupying the intersection between, these spaces of everyday life, administrative, and this symbolic space of the Dataran, right? So by congregating on this space of everyday life, which is just, a perfunctory piece of infrastructure, it's just a road. The contrast with the silence and emptiness of the highly symbolic Dataran could not have been greater. And while protesters were singing and eating and talking together on that junction, the Dataran was left empty, together with its state-prescribed symbolisms. The contrast between the occupied space of everyday life and the symbolic space highlighted the widening gap between the people and the state. So, but even though protesters could not enter the Dataran, it did not stop them from mentioning the square on Twitter. This map shows that the Dataran was the most mentioned place in the tweets sent hashtag Bersih4, and that most of them were in support of the protest. The table also shows some samples of the tweets of various categories. Right? So while the state did not allow the square to be physically entered by the protesters, it did not stop them from discussing it on Twitter. And in the end, the actual physical boundary of the square, it became sort of immaterial. The protesters did not need to cross the boundary to actually claim the Dataran as their own. So I also analyzed these tweets, right, from Bersih 4, but why, right? So the purpose was actually to look at how places were communicated in relation to the protest. So in the beginning, I actually wanted to look at where tweets were coming from, so I would look for a tweet and see if it was actually sent from Jalan Tunku Abdul Rahman, for example, during the protest, right? But this was impossible because most people did not turn on their location services on Twitter. So most of the time, it was not immediately obvious where the tweets were coming from. So given that these were protest-related tweets, it was kind of understandable, that people didn't want, don't want their location to be known, right? So I then focused my analysis on tweets that mentioned places instead of the metadata, the geolocation embedded in the tweets. So I actually found a lot of tweets mentioned places around Kuala Lumpur, and most of the tweets were sent in support of Bersih 4. So I then broke down the sentiment analysis into finer categories, divided into 4 main ones. The first one is, is irrelevant. So these are tweets which are completely irrelevant to the protest. but tagged with Bersih 4, probably because the hashtag was trending, right? And the second one is logistical information, like tweets like access is blocked, trains are not running, restaurant in South Brahman is open, quite an important information. And then the third one is instructions. So do not breach the barriers towards Dataran Merdeka. And the fourth one is descriptive. These are tweets that just describe what was going on, right? And finally, there were mobilization tweets as well, which was then further refined into more specific categories. So most of the tweets actually fell under the inflammatory category. I was expecting more tweets on instructions, but these were actually surprisingly low. But actually it kind of makes sense because this also sort of shows the limitation of my methods, because I was only collecting tweets that were tagged with Bersih 4, whereas most instructions would come from the Twitter account of Bersih itself. And of course, they don't need to use this hashtag, right? I mean, people would just go to them to find out what they need to do. So this was some of the limitation of my methods. Okay, and I wanted to see if there were any patterns related to place in terms of the sentiment of the tweets. So this network graph shows how places are actually clustered according to the sentiment of the tweets that mention them. So for a lot of inflammatory and descriptive tweets, the places mentioned are mostly situated in Malaysia, whereas the solidarity tweets mostly mentioned places abroad. And rather predictably, Malaysia was mentioned a lot with various sentiments attached to it, right? I mean, of course. But I was rather surprised to see that Dataran Merdeka was not mentioned as much as Penang, given that the Dataran was the venue of the protest and Bersih 4 was actually not planned to take place in Penang. So why would there a lot of tweets about Penang? So I did further analysis, and you can see from this word cloud that Penang is mentioned as almost as many times as Malaysia, and mentioned more frequently than Dataran Merdeka and Kuala Lumpur. So I was curious because it seemed like an anomaly, right? As mentioned before, it wasn't designated as a protest venue. So I further examined these tweets that mentioned Penang and found that the sentiment was mostly negative. They were against the protest, and they were tweeted in similar styles, method, and languages. And most of the tweets were amplification tweets, meaning that, it's like retweets, but instead of actually retweeting, they were just copying the tweets and then like over and over and just send them out to be posted. And they also carried the hashtag Change Penang. So after cleaning up the data set, I got rid of these amplification tweets. We can see from this word cloud that then we can see that Penang is significantly reduced. So there were also 168 hashtags that contain name places, place names, and this actually mostly came from Cybertroopers, who coupled place names with sentiments such as Perlis boleh, Melaka maju fasa 2, and Change Penang. So these sentiments reflected their allegiance to the ruling party, since Penang is governed by the opposition party, the AP. And hence, Change Penang actually indicated that the government of Penang needed to be changed. On the other hand, the ruling party won the election in both Melaka and Perlis, and so the sentiments for both places were more positive in nature, right? So the places that they used to tag their tweets are also usually at the level of state. So it's always like Perlis, Melaka, Penang, so state names, right? Instead of like street names or like places in the city like Dataran Merdeka, or Jalan Tempera, like that. So after a while, it became apparent that a large majority of the tweets that contained the 3 hashtags above or use standalone state names as hashtags mostly came from Cybertroopers. Hashtags of standalone places at other scale, such as a city or street, on the other hand, were more prone to support Bersih. The vast difference between the two clouds, where state names are no longer prominent in the second one, indicate the high level of amplification by the Cybertroopers. So who are Cybertroopers? Cybertroopers are social media users whose actions are coordinated and possibly paid for their posts. They're not always paid, but the chances of them being paid are quite high. Since Cybertroopers use social media in the same way as others, meaning they were also generating content, right? And so they were giving the impression that their tweets were uncoordinated, that it's a bottom-up initiative, that it's really what they were thinking. So it was not immediately apparent that they were coordinated, right? So people were more prone to just take for granted that this is really what other people are thinking about this thing. So, and judging by the amount of tweets that they were producing, I came to the conclusion that they were there to drown the conversation by hijacking the timeline with their tweets. Okay, so that was like a couple of ways, how you can simultaneously think about the physical and digital spaces together, right, in the analysis. And one thing that I would actually like to emphasize here is that even though digital methods might allow us to collect data from all over the world remotely, there is actually a lot of value in actually knowing the context that you're working in, right? I wouldn't have been able to detect anything weird with the Penang tweets if I was not already familiar with the socio-political context of Malaysia. And I would not have discovered, what the Cybertroopers were doing. Yeah, okay. So that's all the tweets. Now let's go back to the streets. So this image again, let's revisit that question that basically triggered the whole research. So why are protests mostly still organized in Kuala Lumpur, the colonial city, even after most federal functions have actually moved to Putrajaya? It's purposely designed and built for government functions, right? This city, right? So I'm actually interested in how access to public space can impact the performance of democracy. So let's talk a little bit about theory. What is public space? So public space is typically defined in terms of access and ownership, right? So a public park is both publicly owned and accessible public. But a piece of property can also be both at the same time, right? For example, buildings like the Parliament, right? It's publicly owned, but access is limited. We can't just simply, decide to wake up today and just decide, okay, I want to walk into the Parliament today. That's not going to happen, right? And likewise, some private properties also open access to the premises to the public, such as shopping malls. So when we talk about public space for designers, right? So when we talk about public space in the design studio, we often only focus on one aspect of it, which is the access aspect of public space, right? However, there is actually another aspect of public space. Parkinson in 2012, for example, argued that public space is actually a subset of public sphere. And the public sphere, as Habermas proposed, is conceived when private people come together as a public, and publicness in this instance refer to the role that people assume by participating in matters of public concern. Okay, so all these things, they don't happen in a vacuum. It happens in space. There needs to be a space for this to happen. Okay. Infrastructure enables and disables different kinds of actions in the city. according to Graham and McFarlane into 2015, right? Infrastructure, therefore, can enable or disable political actions and public space, which is part of the infrastructure in the city, should also be assessed through its ability to enable people to perform their citizenship. So now we are going to discuss two things which are both related to urban planning and governance of the city, right? One, how decisions made at urban planning level can actually impact democratic performance in the city. And secondly, how despite the above, protest can still be silenced through the control of public space. So firstly, how decisions made at urban planning level can actually impact democratic performance in the city. So let's revisit, the question that I asked earlier, right? Why do people still protest in Kuala Lumpur and not in Putrajaya? So through my analysis, it can be broken down into these three factors: accessibility, land use distribution, and scale of urban form. Okay, so firstly, accessibility. So accessibility is very important for protests because street protests often rely on the turnout numbers as an indicator of success. So a lot of people actually need to be able to access the venue of the protest. There is also a strength in number. The more people there are, the less easy it would be for the authorities to intimidate the crowd, right? So for accessibility, I mapped the distance between the places people are most likely to congregate to protest and the closest rail station. So for Putrajaya, one of the places would be the Prime Minister's office, of course. So from this isochrone map, you can see that, even after walking for 30 minutes, you would still not reach the ERL station. Of course, this works the other way, lah, kan? I mean, if you were to get off at the ERL station, it would take maybe like 40 minutes for you to get to the Prime Minister's office. And we can see the same situation if we were to apply the analysis to the Palace of Justice. This is another potential venue for protest, right? So in Putrajaya, the most efficient way of getting around is by driving, right? This is like typical of any cities in Malaysia. This is KL, and I mapped walking distance from Dataran Merdeka because it's basically everybody wants to protest there. And as you can see, within 10 minutes of walking, there are already like 5 rail stations. You walk 20 minutes, within 20 minutes of walking, you add another 8 rail stations. And within 30 minutes, you add 7 more stations. So in total, there are about 20 stations that you can walk from to Dataran Merdeka. So what this does is it gives you options, right? Sometimes they shut down like some of the stations, right? But it's impossible to shut down the service for the whole city. But then you also might argue, right? I mean, but if they were to do that, if they were to like shut down the train services, completely, then what happens? We are back to square one. But are we really? Okay. Now we take a look at the land use distribution of both Putrajaya and KL, right? So the land use distribution in Putrajaya, it has this zoning logic, right? And the zoning brush is also quite broadly applied to the master plan. And apart from that, Putrajaya's economy, or rather the program, the main program of Putrajaya is basically dominated by administrative functions. And the housing there is mostly built to house the civil servants. So if we were to compare that with KL, with its more fine-grained mix of functions, it not only provides a ready audience for the protests, but also potential new protesters who might be attracted to participate on the day itself, right? Because they were already there. And the mix of functions also provide a camouflage for protesters, right? Who could remain anonymous in the city crowd until the very last moment before the protest begins. And likewise, when protesters are being chased by the police, they could slip into shops and hotels and pretend to be shoppers and customers. And this was what this happened. This was actually demonstrated by the 1998 Reformasi rallies in the city. This also supports accessibility, Even if you were to drive into the city for the protest, the city has so many functions that you can use as an excuse to enter the city, right? But if you were to do this in Putrajaya, it would be very conspicuous, especially since most protests are actually held in the weekends, right? When Putrajaya is empty. So if there were a roadblock, what excuse can you give the police, that you want to get into the city? But for KL, there's just so many other things happening that, this can be used as an excuse. So urban form, on the other hand, influences the street protests in two ways. So firstly, the movement trajectory of the protest and also the production of image. So street protest is an activity that requires visibility in order to be noticed. And yet at the same time, the possibility of escape, right? Should there be clashes, right? I mean, you want people to notice you, but if things get rough, you don't want to be there anymore. And while, wide and uninterrupted boulevards may seem like a great setting for a protest march, Baron Haussmann cut Paris through with this typology in order to quell dissent, right? Since boulevards actually enable troops to penetrate the city easier, and at the same time, limit the ability of protesters to construct barricades. It's not easy to fill in this 100-meter space, okay? I mean, if you were to construct barricades, you would need a lot of material more than trying to construct barricades on a 20-meter street. So since accessibility, land use, and urban form are determined by city planners and administrators, especially for an instant city like Putrajaya, the architecture of the city can be designed to enable or disable the performance of democracy. So the architecture of Putrajaya, it's not just a mimicry, right, in terms of the jumble of styles, borrowed from elsewhere, imposed on the structures and urban design, but in disabling the performance of democracy, the planning actually sort of mimics a very colonial attitude towards space, right? So now we go on to the second point, how protests can be silenced through the control of public space. So even though Dataran Merdeka is the most desirable space in KL for protests, actually protesters were often barred from entering Dataran. And this piece of legislation, it determines the do's and don'ts on the Dataran. Section 4, for example, lists 19 items that cannot be done without the consent of the mayor, and this includes like really banal things, like eating, drinking, smoking, stepping on the grass. So you cannot step on the grass, okay, if the mayor doesn't give consent to do that, and lying down on the grass. And section 8, on the other hand, dictates any kind of assembly cannot take place without a permit from the mayor. So one of the excuses often given to not allow protests to take place in the city is the potential loss of income caused by road closures. But then, the Dataran is also often used to host corporate events such as, the KL Marathon, or to host celebrations such as Independence Day, which is a state-sponsored spectacle, right? And on these days, most roads within the vicinity will be closed anyway. But you never hear all of these talks about, people will lose their income. So in Southeast Asia, the lack of provision and maintenance of public space by the state have actually led private enterprise to fill this gap. So you can see this happening in Jakarta, Bangkok, and Manila as well, where there's a lot of shopping malls, which is basically a symptom of the lack of provision of public goods. People need places to visit so that they can actually just be with other people, right? Not necessarily for shopping. So instead of public space, shopping malls then become the meeting place, a social space where people actually spend their spare time. And why is this problematic? So this is problematic because shopping malls are commercial spaces which are driven by profit. Your freedom of expression does not quite make it through the doors of the shopping mall because it is seen as disrupting the process of consumption. So what privatization does is it diminishes democracy by reducing the space and channels where democracy can be performed. Right. So from this analysis of the geography of protests in Kuala Lumpur in relation to urban planning, we can see that publicness can be fostered at the urban planning or urban design decision-making level, and neoliberal urban planning is actually is terrible democracy. And while aspects like land use, distribution, and accessibility, and even urban form are always discussed in relation to topics like livability and walkability, I find that the discourse, at least in the Malaysian context, is often depoliticized. And that is dangerous because then we tend to advocate for a particular kind of public space where the only publicness allowed is aligned with leisure and commerce. And then we're just basically becoming more neoliberal, right? Okay, this is my final slide. Okay, so from my presentation, we have seen how public space is not just about the material, physical public space, but it also transcends into other spheres as well. We have seen how they are always interrelated and interdependent on one another. And think about how we live our lives, right? More often than not, we occupy and straddle these two spaces at the same time. So when we discuss things like access to public space and issues like privatization, we can't just talk about the privatization of land, the privatization of spaces, We also need to talk about, to be aware that these digital spaces that we use are actually and run, right? Okay, so my final word to designers is when you talk about public space, when you talk about designing public space, think about which public you're designing for. What does it like? What are they doing? Are you providing the space for a particular kind of public which is deemed productive? Right, of people like eating and having fun, just hanging out in these clean public spaces, But have you ever actually considered these other publics which are often marginalized? People who are sleeping rough, and even the focus of our discussion today, the dissenting public. Thank you. That'll be all.
Wonderful, wonderful, Azreen. I've been, knowing your topic for long, but it was until today, the very first time I'm able to listen to such an, interesting, provocative, and is very dive into every aspect of the performance of democracy that that you're looking at. Now, after listening to you, I just go back to your topic. Now I start realize why you are using such a beautiful word as ritual, right? Now, when you sent me your topic that day, I was very interested the way that how you named the topic as ritual of democracy in the city, right? Now, it's certainly a beautiful word, and it's also uncommon at the same time. Like, ritual somehow, referring to a certain cultural or practices, or a religion practices. But in the way that you are trying to framing the ritual is an act of performance, right? Toward the democracy in the sense. Right. Really, really insightful listening to this talk, right? Okay, so what we will do in the next half an hour, I suppose, question, right? From floor, then we can actually further discuss on thing. Now, Azreen, you may also read by yourself from the chat box. Yep. Now there are two questions. Thank you so much. Yeah. From Zikri and also Amiru. Now, first question from Zikri asking on the cyberspace, right? So it's not necessarily, right? But as you pointing that it's always referring to a certain geographical dimension in the tweet, right? So because it's still very much entitled or embedded into a actual space, right, of the democracy, of the protest, right? So therefore, there's always the interesting about place and non-place, a virtual or material, that kind of dichotomy. Now, I suppose he would like to have your opinion about the emergence of Cybertrooper and also the politics of misinformation. What if this thing are more increasingly happen. Now, I suppose that on the aspect of Cybertrooper, you actually talked a bit in the talk just now. So maybe you want to respond to that further, and more into the misinformation, and also respond to others cases in Hong Kong, China, which you think the kind of virtual space, and also how actually they are mobilized, right? Please.
Okay, yeah, I'm reading the question. So SSR even had a pro-Chinese YouTuber equating Lawan with HK protest. So I guess not in a nice way, because if they are pro-China, then it wouldn't be nice, right? So the thing about the Cybertroopers is that it's a constantly evolving tactic, because I mean, even as I was mentioning earlier, right? I mean, even the way that I collected the data, how Twitter functioned back then, is a completely different Twitter than what we have today. And of course, this would then change how people use this digital technology. And then, of course, Cybertroopers would always have to they would always have to be aware, right, on the latest culture of communication, and they will always latch on to that. And I am probably not the right person to be advising on this, because well, my background is architecture, right? So I did not do communication studies of stuff like that. I'm sure that there are people who are actually studying these things, who would have more insights. But yeah, I mean, that's the thing. I mean, if I publish a paper on this, on the Cybertroopers, and I think by the time it was published, all the things that I mentioned is probably already irrelevant, because things move very fast, right? So I think what can we do, right? I mean, it's just to remain vigilant and to notice. I mean, I sort of actually noticed how between 2015, when I was collecting the data, the tweets for the protest, and if we compare that with the tweets that were sent during the 2018 election, right? The last GE, there was already so many differences. For example, during the election, there were a lot more tweets from bots, and they would be particularly supporting, or criticizing particular groups or politicians, right? And after a while, you can sort of detect you know, that because they will always tweet in the same way, because these are bots, right? And it is very difficult for who are actually setting up these bots to have like differentiation between like one bot to another, for example, right? I mean, between the tweets, not one bot to another, it's just bots. Yeah, so I think what would be useful is actually to identify the trends, you know, and just make it public, right? And I think that would really help. But of course, you know, the moment you do this, the tactics would change, right? So it's a constantly evolving thing, you know. So yeah, I think that's my 2 cents about this thing.
Right, thank you. Then we move on to the second question from Amiru. Um, um, okay, the advancement of cyberspace, right, is kind of extension of our actual urban public space, right? So it becoming an extension of a place for expression, emotion, right? And also in related to urban mental health, right? And people are enjoying, you know, being in a virtual sphere. Now, the question is, what is your opinion of the future placemaking enhanced or extended with a digital space, right?
Okay. First of all, I have an issue with the term placemaking because it seems like, I mean, the way that people always go about with placemaking, you know, it's always like, it's always mostly focused or like favoring certain kinds of public, right? What I was talking about earlier. So, I mean, and of course, you know, these things are like, of course, with digital space, you know, it can definitely enhance placemaking. But the question is, what kind of place do you want to create? Is the question, you know. And then right now we also have like with the advancement of like, you know, IoT, and then now we have like these things called like the digital twin, right, where you actually recreate this physical space in the digital space, right? And in a way, sort of like preserving this space as well, but also like in a very like ephemeral way. But yeah, I mean, I think that the question is always about like, it always falls back to what kind of place that you want to create, you know, because whatever it is that you want to create, this can always be extended or expanded by this cyberspace as well. And it can be dangerous as well, right? Because, you know, like things like surveillance, right? Yeah. So yeah.
All right, cool. Then, yeah, a reply from Sikri is remind me on how the ritual always should change from time to time. Now it's more a constant ritual and a more a tactful, you know, the kind of ritual that is constantly evolved, right? And yeah. Now, meanwhile, we are waiting for more questions. Yeah, please feel free to, you know, posting any question for our speaker or any comment from the floor, right? Now, maybe a question from myself that is, I really, you know, interesting. You know, that exactly is a question that has been, you know, asking myself for a long time. Why, you know, why there's no such a performance of democracy back in Putrajaya, right? And always that actually focusing in the city center, you know, is more the historic core of the city. Now, after listening to you, and all, you know, the factor that you found out, which is, you know, it totally makes sense. It totally makes sense to me on all the 3 points that you are talking on that. Now, there's something to ponder upon, is that now, of course, when we are asking, you know, the respondent or the people regarding how do they plan for the movement, there could be, you know, some easy answer on accessibility, you know, things like that. Now, of course, it's very important. Now, I'm just wondering that what is the symbolic part of performing. Like, I'm really struck with the word like ritual, how you use the word ritual in like putting into this context. Now, I'm just wondering, how to what extent do you think the historic core of the city is still very much playing a role, a vital role, in the sense that become a gathering place for this performance. I mean, from the symbolic aspect of it. Do you know what I mean? It's like I wanted to know like what the essence of that, being into the city's core of the KL, right? And in front, surrounded with the Dataran Merdeka area, that how matter on that. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for that question. I think this is really well demonstrated by the Bersih for protest, right? When they actually they occupied that piece of junction in front of the Dataran, and sort of left this like symbolic. I mean,
yeah, it's become an icon, right? It's an iconic, right?
Yeah, it's so pregnant with symbolism, right? But then at the same time, it's also like it was left empty, and I find that really that disconnect, that that contrast, really jarring. And I mean, okay, it started, as this colonial space, and then we celebrated it, and then City Hall really wanted to like, okay, this is like an important space, symbol of emancipation from colonial rule, so we have to preserve it. Right? You have to preserve it. But at the same time, when you are preserving the space, then you are just like you are just taking over this vacuum left by the colonizers. You are becoming the same people, right? Because the way that you govern the space is the same as they used to govern the space. So for the Dataran to be fully independent or liberated, then the way it's governed has to change, right? So you have that layer of colonial history, and then you have this like layer of like preservation, and then at the same time, I think because of that, I mean, in a way, the authorities sort of they were setting up this thing, right? Because they really wanted to preserve this space, and it is also the most accessible space in the city. So of course it became very, very attractive for people to like, yeah, I want to protest there because at the same time, it is the most direct way to challenge the symbolism, right? Yeah, so which is why I find that Bersih for not actually occupying the space is actually more powerful, I think, than actually managing to occupy that space, right? Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter because we're talking about it on like Twitter and stuff, right? So
right.
So which is why I really like how the organizer of Lawan, I think Tharma, I think he was the one who mentioned that, yeah, I mean, Dataran has like these layers of protest history, so they sort of wanted to like to respect that, to pay respect to that, and he didn't mention at all about this colonial history, which was I've actually found very, very refreshing.
Right. Yeah.
So
thanks.
Sort of keep on building, right?
Yeah. Exactly. That has been something I wonder as well. Now, why not? I'm just realizing that Prof. Tajudin is with us in this webinar. Hi, Prof. Would be good that we can invite Prof into the discussion, right? Hi, Prof. Hi, Prof.
Hey, hello everybody. Thank you, Azreen, Nurul, huh?
Oh, Azreen.
From the discussion here. I thought to myself just now, wow, somebody talking about public space and also about democracy. And then she talked about demonstrations. I think it's time for me to retire. No need to talk about politics anymore in the country, because everybody looks very strange. Professor Tajudin, the professor of architecture, what does he know about religion or politics and things like that? But strangely enough, now I'm being interviewed alongside with political analysts from the field of political science. Okay, very interesting. I'm actually I'm not a person who goes to demonstrations. Never have. But I do attend ceramah, during the times of, and I remember attending 40,000, 50,000 people strong coming in, especially in Johor when I was working at UTM. So that is another interesting study that no one has done, because during the Barisan Nasional period, the idea of using public space was, in a sense, kind of being denied by the so-called authorities. I don't like to use the words authority, because in democracy, these people are civil servant. They're servant to the people. This thing is not taught at schools, nor is it emphasized in the universities. And that's why we have a failed state or failed nation in that sense. One question that I wanted to raise with Nurul was the planning of universities, public universities. One of my colleagues at one time made a mention to me and said that when I was asking at the height of Reformasi and all that, I said, how come there are not much public squares in the public universities? If you look at UTM especially, and you come in, there's a big building, and of course they don't really have any kind of a public space. In my university, there's a big square in front of the library. I mean, those things are standard. So one of the questions that I like to ask my theory student is what are the elements in a university, whether it's private or public, that gives you the sense of empowerment that you are actually the number one important entity in the campus. And usually they find it very hard to answer because they don't understand the idea of democracy being that they are the one that is the boss in a sense, and so they are always subservient to the authorities. So don't step on this grass, don't use this stand, they use this one, those kinds of things. So they have no. So I have to give clues such as, well, how come they don't have a parliament for students? A parliament for students. I always say that the university is the test of First Nation. I always say that because you put all these orang pandai-pandai and then you condition them to jadi bodoh-bodoh. So that is a problem. And when you I remember when students did a lot of nice sculptures and we put it up in the Fakulti Alam Bena, the dean came in and said, ini apa semua tak cantik lah dia punya tu, and get rid of it. I mean that was the student square that we meet all the time to do things. So this kind of authority, which has already forgotten that they are actually serving in a sense a student, which is the raison d'être for the idea of the university, which is the student. And so, do you find that public universities, the new ones being designed like UIA, UTM, and further on after that UUM, after the Mahathir era, that the sense of public in the university, of course, public space is missing in that regard. Maybe you can comment on that.
Yeah, actually in my work, I also look at like the history of activism in the country, right? And it's actually quite interesting how, I mean, we used to have like a very vibrant student activism, right? I mean, it was time of Anwar Ibrahim, in the 70s. And then, of course, then there were AUKU, right? So which basically just muzzle anyone, and Ops Lalang as well, they just went around and just like took away these people, right? Journalists, academics and stuff. And at the same time, universities also started to be built like away from the city, right? If before this, like for example, UM is right smack in KL. So students were actually part of the city. They were actually very engaged with city life, and they always know what's going on, and I think at one point, if people, I think there was an issue in Johor at like in the 70s, so the first thing that the people did, was actually to find a student leader like, hey, can you fight for us, right? So this was during the time of University Malaya. But in the 70s, then they started building these new universities, and this would always be built in like faraway places. So you have like UUM, like, you know, up north, and then you have like UTM, Skudai, it's nothing there, right? And so this sort of like provide a further disconnect of like students from the people, right? Pelajar dan masyarakat terpisah. So at the same time, you know, with AUKU, so both of these things, you know, like physically actually removing students from society, and then having all of these legislations, you know, all of these rules, then also like sort of suppress students, right? And then we also have to remember that the current crop of academics that we have in universities now, you know, these are basically the people who actually benefited from the DEB. Right. So why, if I went to university when there was no student activism, you know, so it's actually very difficult for me to actually understand this, to actually internalize this, right? And so actually I think the younger ones, you know, these Gen Z students, they really are our future, because they are really breaking out from this from this mold. Yeah, I mean, we can have all of these nice spaces, you know, like in UTM, Johor, in Skudai, we have the Agora, right? Nice name, you know, reminiscent of the Greeks, right? But then it's also interesting because I think it wasn't intentional, but by using the term Agora, you know, which I guess, you know, they want to create like this public space. I mean, the public space during the Greek time was also not truly public, right? Because not everybody could be part of that public. You have to be a free man, you know, you have to be a citizen. So if you were a slave, then you cannot join, you cannot go to the Agora to take part, you know. And if you were a woman, I mean, I would definitely wouldn't have been able to do that. I mean, so I guess in a way it's also like a sort of like self-fulfilling prophecy, like, you know, by having these names, right, in these universities. Yeah.
Basically, the university has become what I call sekolah asrama penuh.
Yes.
It's nothing more than that, and that is why the idea of pushing it out to the, and the most telling thing is the fences. I mean, I've been to universities in the United States and UK. I've never seen one with fences. Okay, so that is the tragedy of nation building, and people asking what's going on with politics. Where I told many people. I told a journalist once. I said at the height before the 2018, she asked what's going to happen to Malaysia if this political party and that political party takes over, blah blah blah. And I said the fate of Malaysia doesn't depend on the political party. It depends on the university. And she looked at me and said, well, just because you're a professor, then you say something about university. And I said, truly, if the university does not put the idea of democracy and the sense of developing the nation upon the responsibility of the student, then who are we putting out as leaders in the community, industry, and that sort of thing? And recently, Bak Minister Fuller, in a celebration of Bak Minister Fuller's birthday, I was asked to give a speech and all that. And I really found out that Bak Minister Fuller said the tragedy of university education is a specialization. You see, because you specialize into architecture, into engineering, everything else you forget. Okay, you don't know poetry, you don't know history, you don't know philosophy, you don't know all these things. All you know are the columns and beams and a few other stuffs. And that is where he said that you are producing tools that has no vision about whatever. And now I'm coining the word in next month to give a talk in global education on the idea of global spirituality, meaning something that transcends the identity of religion, but has a sense of why are we and what can we do to have a different life for the benefit of all. This sense of, I call it spirituality. Some people say, you know, spirituality is going to sit in Makkah and all that. And I no longer believe in that, because I found something bigger, and I think the problem here is that the university and the education does not teach the critical aspect of historical narratives, and does not teach the idea of ownership of the country in democracy, and they do not teach the aspect of a possible different way of life rather than going out, having a work, has a salary, and then the idea of living with less was never taught. The idea of seems to be that the more you have, the more then you are successful, something like that. But when you see the YouTuber doing less but then having their own life, the university is not it's not in the business to advocate those kinds of alternate ideas and alternate thinking. And so that is where I said the university has become a fixed menu entity to condition people into what I call modern slavery, modern slavery. Okay, so this is a bigger aspect. I say if you don't solve that, then what kind of cities are you going to be designing? Lastly, I would just say that one time the ambassador of I think Poland gave a speech, and I was there, and he said that the buildings that were destroyed in World War II, we sat down and we decided we want to preserve it, we want to keep it, and so we want to give it like that. And then he said, and then we decide to give the spaces to the people. So that was a very, very strong statement. And so these DBKL people don't understand that they work for those students who were demonstrating. That this is the problem, is it? Okay, I told in the press, they said the job of the DBKL is simply to clean the Dataran Merdeka and have a schedule of activities. Itu saja. It's not your job to go and tahan orang. That's not your damn business, man. Okay, so this thing is not educated embedded in the curriculum of education. So that's how it is.
Thanks, Prof. Interesting discussion. Right, we're extending from the public space into the university. All right, there's always applicable. Now, I think there's a few more questions before come to the end. Thanks, Mark Tay. There's one question from Mark. Now, regarding the unseen, or rather the homeless people that we know many of them actually in the city, right? So, what is your stand? Asking the speaker on their their existence, or being the right to the city for the homeless people as well in the city center.
Okay, right. Yeah, it's true. I mean, I'm reading the comment now, and yeah, it's true that these homeless communities seem to be resilient, right? I mean, they're still there no matter how many times the BKL attempted to clear them out. I mean, I think during Lawan, as I was walking towards the protest, I was observing the protest then. I noticed that by the side of the river, where the river of life is, right, of these new benches, right, it was actually occupied by the homeless. And yeah, so the occupation of space by those who are sleeping rough in the city center. Yeah, so I mean, if we are talking about the design of spaces, right, I mean, I'm not saying that, okay, then maybe we should like design so that these spaces can be like to serve this particular function, but we have to expand like the public that we are designing for. I mean, so actually what I'm advocating is like robustness in the design of public spaces. That the public space can be used for many different purposes, right? And at one time it can be used for like like your normal banal activity, like you're just having your sandwich there, and then the next moment somebody's using it for protest. But at the same time, it also the street furniture, for example, is also not designed to like drive out the homeless, for example. You don't have like this what do you call it, like hostile architecture, right? So and maybe some of the street furniture or some even the configuration of the space, can actually provide shelter, to those who need it, right? And so that's what I mean, that the space, it has to be robust. It has to be prepared for all kinds of activities, right? I mean, because if we just want to talk about, say, for example, in my mind, I want to design this public space with benches so that people during their lunchtime, they can just go there and take a break and eat their sandwiches, for example, so then I would need like to provide some benches, for example, right? But then I'm also thinking that, oh, I don't like the homeless, so I'm going to provide these benches, that people can sit on, but you cannot lie on them, right? So I mean that then sort of exposes my own prejudices, around these other kinds of public, right? So this is what I mean, that when we're designing, we always have to think about how these spaces might be used for purposes which are not so mainstream, I suppose. Yeah, I hope that answered your question, Mark.
Right, thanks. All right, then we have a question from Yusra. Now, it's rather a bit twisting, which is, can you read from that question?
Okay.
What is the importance?
Importance or significance of public or rally space with the existence of cyberspace? Very important. Okay. Is the public rally the extension of cyberspace or cyber tweeting, or cyberspace or tweeting is the extension of public rally or public space? Very interesting question. Yeah, I would actually argue that, I mean, I think from my research into the whole thing, right, it's sort of it has shown that nobody actually take your cause seriously until you actually go to the streets, right? Because we can all like start tweeting now. You can go to Facebook, use a particular hashtag or whatever. If I don't like it, I will just mute the hashtag, right? And then I won't see your tweet or your post anymore, right? But when you actually go to the streets, and these things would actually then travel back into the cyberspace, right? So it's not a matter of which one is the extension or the other, because it is a process which is constantly going. One fits into the other constantly. Like, okay, let's use a very recent example. The Lawan protest, right? I think it's a very thoughtfully planned protest, because I mean, I've been observing them, and I could see that they were doing it in like stages, so starting with the hashtag, right? And then they had like the bendera hitam, right? So if you are not happy, you just at 3 p.m. I think on a Saturday, then you just pasang lah this bendera hitam on your window. So in a way, you're not leaving the house, but you are sort of entering that space, that physical space, right? And then of course, some people started like taking pictures of this, and then this fits back into like the digital space, right? And then it escalated a little bit, right? And then they did something else, right? And then finally they were like, okay, let's go to the streets, right? So by this time, this it's a constant thing, right? The protest is constantly happening, even though you haven't gone to the street yet, right? So people go to the street, and then images from this started going back into like social media and everything, and then now there's probably another one this coming Saturday. So it is a process which is constantly feeding into one another. So I think maybe it's not so productive to think about whether one is the extension of the other, but we have to think about this as like one space, but just like different sides of the same space. I guess that's what I'm saying. Yeah.
Thanks, Azreen. Okay, then move on to the next question from Ren Singh. Yeah. Now, this participant pointing about saying a case of in Klang Valley. Now, I'm sure that the issues on state and non-state owned spaces, right, is not only happening, in Klang Valley. I think basically, many places across Malaysia, it has been like increasingly being privatized or actually like strictly governed by the state, right? And then, in other words, local authority. Now, how do you think could we be more involving, or we can be, be more participatory into the public space, right? And to redefine the usage of the space.
Right. Yeah, I think I want to take this question also like from the perspective of how like local authorities are also using like market logic to govern their space. So for example, in certain spaces, if you start doing something which is like sometimes like really banal things, right? Somebody would just like this police bantuan, right? Would just come and tell you, hey, you cannot do that here. And you're like, but this is public space. This is not like private space. So what's the problem, right? But it's like, no, you cannot do that here. So I think the first thing that we can do, just to like to test out, the publicness of these spaces by trying to do something which is maybe just a tiny bit out of the ordinary, but maybe not too disruptive, just to test the reaction, right? I was I was observing this group, KL Sketch Nation. I think they're a group, they go around the city and then they do like these urban sketches together, right? So one day they were sketching in that lane, Kasturi Walk, I think, right next to Central Market, right? So, like it's a really banal and like really friendly activity, right? They were just there sketching. And then this police bantuan came and tell them that, no, you cannot do this here, right? So I think at that moment, when they shared it online, it sort of like exposed like this hypocrisy, right, of the management of the space, even though it is a public space, right? And then in another moment, I think they were sketching in front of Lot 10. So okay, it's a private space. But the organizer really took it online, and I think at one point, the owner of Lot 10, the guys who run Lot 10 was like, oh, this cannot happen, this is really bad for our reputation. Like, and then they were actually invited to be part of this like program inside Lot 10, so that they can sketch, right? So I think what we can do is constantly, rather than going to the city hall and submitting our bantahan or whatever, the first thing that we can do in our like everyday life, is to just test the limit of what we can do in particular spaces, and of course, like again, when we talk about this social media thing, whatever it is, just like share it with the people, because the people who run these spaces, they would not like this kind of attention, right? Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Cool. Then perhaps is our last question from Clarissa.
Sorry, Keng-Khoon.
Hey, hi. Yes.
Yeah. Maybe I offer an alternative way from what Nurul was saying, just so that the UCSI doesn't get into much trouble with that suggestion. I think that is a very orang muda punya suggestion, which I welcome. No problem for me. But then, of course, I've always mentioned that the university lacks a lot of what we call intellectual activities, for instance, like forums like this and discussion sessions. So as an alternative to what Nurul has said about doing stuff there, and then there are things that might happen, and then you go on social media. That is one correct way. I mean, one way to do it. The other is to, which I keep complaining, that the students don't even have an architectural association among themselves in order to become a kind of a voice not necessarily bantahan. You don't go and write a form and bantah to the DBKL. What you do is you have a forum, and then you make sure that you have the Free Malaysia Today or Malaysia Kini to cover it. And of course, you have your Wakil Rakyat. You can call them and then ask, look, what's wrong with this thing and what's wrong with that. And then you can see that I have seen how this government is very frightened of opinions of people, what they call netizens and all that. If it is done properly, not with this, with crude languages and with what I call no adab, with adab. So the other way to do this or to make the changes that the student was asking is through what we call the other one. Nurul says is also democratic, but this one is also democratic, but it has the element of so-called intellectual discourse. All right, so intellectual discourse, there is a way. Like if you do this intellectual discourse here, not really much impact. Yeah, if I put her on Harith Iskandar, then there's a big impact, because there are 40,000 people following the show. So that is where we need to have the students, and I don't know how. I've already asked them. You guys need to organize yourself first into a kind of a persatuan, and run activities. And the activities is just satu, explaining to the public what is the concern and the issues. And number two is advocating certain things. And that one, you can have an engagement with your friendly Wakil Rakyat, or even with your inviting the DBKL people and nicely asking them the questions and putting it on. That has a potential of actually putting them on the spot in a very legal and halal way, I would say.
Thanks, Prof.
Somebody got legal and halal.
Yeah, for the advice.
Yeah, but I mean, I completely agree with that, and I think that we can sort of marry that with the social media aspect, in a sense that because okay, to do things in this country, there's a lot of hurdles, right? There's a lot of red tapes, right? The moment the student body wants to do something, kena buat kertas kerja lah, whatever lah kan. I mean, I'm a lecturer, I should know, right? So I think by also like constantly informing the public about this process, you're also sort of like exposing lah, like, how undemocratic the whole process can be. Because like it or not, they might not even get to organize this thing, right? It might not even materialize. So, which is why I also argue in my thesis is that the protest doesn't actually start the moment that people hit the streets, or when they tell people on Twitter that, okay, let's go, Bersih for whatever date, right? Come to the street. I mean, that is sort of the beginning. But actually, the protest begins when they started negotiating with the authorities and they make it public, right? So they go to the police, and tell police, under Akta Pimpinan Aman, I don't actually need to ask for permission anymore, but I need to inform you 10 days before, right? So all of these conversations, all these negotiations, the outcome, if it's shared with the public, then that is when the protest actually happens. So, I mean, going to the streets or getting these forums organized, if you get to do it, it's great. But actually documenting the process and sharing it with the public is also super, super important, because otherwise, you might do a lot of work to organize this and then nothing comes out of it, and then you just get disappointed, right? So yeah, use social media wisely, guys.
Right, thanks for the point. Now, come back to the last question. Now, Carissa asking on, now, yeah, this is definitely spot on to how to empower, a participant, a more, a public into participate into a planning processes, and is mentioning about Jeffrey Ho, from a messy urbanism, or the insurgent public space, I suppose. Yeah, there's a few books from Jeffrey Ho. on this kind of subaltern or insurgent, or another word, people also call it like guerrilla urbanism, which is, is more the kind of informal. So what is your point on that sort of planning in our context, I suppose?
Yeah, that's the thing, right? I think with like Jeff Ho's work, it's like you just do it, right? You see a patch of land, you want to plan something, just do it. And I think this is what we need to do. We need to challenge it, right? Because like it or not, all these spaces, I mean, it's really strange, because from one perspective, it's like there's very little maintenance, but at the same time, the authorities can also be quite protective, of their powers, right? Like, you cannot do that here, right? I mean, I remember talking to I think I went to like kebun bangsa, like Saxon, and I was talking to somebody there, and he said that it took them years to actually, because they were going back and forth, from like the from TNB, because it's under these pylons, right? And then to DBKL, and then it's like years of just like constantly going from one one authority to another just to get the permission to just plant something, underneath these pylons. So I mean, I think it's really, really important that we really explore this this method of like reclaiming space in the city, and sometimes you just need to do it, right? I mean, it's easier to ask for forgiveness than to ask for permission, right? So
what a
please forget I said that.
I know. No, I mean, like that is a quote that we all
Can't hear you. Okay.
sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Now, I suppose we have respond to all the question. Yeah, and we almost come to the end of the webinar, and thank you so much again for the speaker, Dr. Azreen, with us today, and with this such a interesting, provocative topic. And also, I really like the interaction with the participant as well. And Prof. Tajudeen, thank you. And I think amongst the participants, we have a really a diverse background. People from the practitioner, or even from I'm not sure what the background of the audience, but I hope all of you found this webinar somehow be really informative and more reflective for your own works. Be you as an architect, or be you as anyone doing the work. Now, I think the concept back to what the core values of this webinar is about democracy, right? It's the values of how being reclaiming the right to the city, and be more active player in our urban sphere. And that, basically is the argument and also the vision that we are all looking into, right? Now, if I may, I just end this talk with, borrowing a quote, from our hero, right? Now, we are not far from Merdeka. I mean, for our National Day, it's about a week to go. Now, I would like to end this webinar by borrowing such an important statement from Tunku Abdul Rahman to the promise of Merdeka. Now, looking at our political landscape and scenario right now, our country is basically at a crossroad, right? So we are still looking into the new government, and of course, suffering from the pandemic, and many people are in a struggle. Now, this is really, I think, as a younger generation and being active part of the society, we always remind us the values of being a Malaysian, being a nation. So as what we learn from Tunku Abdul Rahman, we desire to view a country of which we can be justly and truly proud. A country to which we can be truly royal. In short, a new nation of Malaysia. A country in which we can live and share our happiness in brotherhood. A democracy of many races and creeds living in peace and harmony. Now, let's remind, and reflect on this important vision that has been, inherited by Tunku Abdul Rahman to all of us who love Malaysia, and we all, be proud of Malaysia to that. Okay, right. So thank you so much once again to speaker, to all the audience. I hope you found this joyful and also, informative for you. Right. A good day, everyone, and take care. We shall see you in the next public lecture. All right. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.